Well, welcome to week 7 of Intro to American Politics. This week, we're going to be covering 2 of the other institutions of government, the bureaucracy and the courts. And I know that this is a little disjointed in terms of how the chapters are laid out in the text, but I think once you read through the bureaucracy chapter, you'll see how it more readily connects to what we just covered, and that was the presidency. The bureaucracy is housed within the executive branch, but it gets a lot of interaction from all 3 branches of government. So I thought it'd be best to go ahead and assign the bureaucracy immediately following the presidency, and then we'll wrap up with a study of the courts. So again, just to give a brief overview of where we are in the game of politics. Certainly we have been talking about politics in terms of how people interact with government, but also how government interacts. We've talked about Congress, we've talked about the presidency, this week the bureaucracy and the courts. And then next week, we'll get into the policy, the decision making, and how that all kind of connects together. We spent a lot of time on power and politics. We'll get into public policy next week, and hopefully you'll see how the game has kind of evolved and developed in terms of this idea of a game of power. Certainly, we've talked about the ideas, we've talked about the political behavior, the players, interest groups, political parties, voters, citizens, public opinion, the media. And we've been talking about, since last week, kind of the fields and places where the game is played. The game is played in Congress. The game has been played in the presidency. This week, we'll see it play out in the bureaucracy or in the courts. But as well, think about how these institutions of government can be players as well. And so we're going to continue this theme of government institutions, the structures of government, and we'll speak specifically about the bureaucracy. Oftentimes people deride the bureaucracy, it's so bureaucratic. Well, the bureaucracy is what actually makes government run. What we see play out in terms of what government does is oftentimes done through the bureaucracy. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the judiciary, what people commonly know as the courts. So in thinking about the bureaucracy and the courts, again, much like with the legislature, Congress, much like with the executive branch, the presidency, they can be both a field and a player in the game of politics. Where politics is played out is oftentimes through the bureaucracy as well as through the courts. But the courts can be players, the bureaucrats can be players as well in the game of politics. And oftentimes when I teach this course, and particularly upper level courses on bureaucratic politics, on the judicial process, these 2 institutions are typically the least known, but they are just as important as the other branches. Everybody tends to know about the president, who the president is, what the president is doing. They'll probably know about Congress, but maybe not as specific as the president. But the bureaucracy and the courts are typically less known, but they have just as much power in terms of the roles that they present as do the president and Congress. Now, the key things to think about when it comes to the bureaucracy as kind of a big picture idea is that it ultimately serves 3 masters. You're going to see and read through the particular chapter about the bureaucracy that it has to interact oftentimes centered on the president, but it relies so much on Congress and the courts for its powers as well. But once it's been established, it has developed its own power structure in comparison to the 3 other branches. Bureaucrats, those who work in the bureaucracy, oftentimes write rules. You can think of this as kind of lawmaking powers. If somebody is writing a rule or a regulation, that you have to abide by are those really lawmaking powers. They also execute and enforce the law. This is because they are part of the executive branch. They are the law executors. But then sometimes they have to regulate behavior and oftentimes resolve conflicts. Well, as we'll get into with the courts, that's oftentimes what we call law adjudicating, the law resolution, resolving legal conflicts. The bureaucracy has all of these powers. They can write rules, they can execute, they can regulate and resolve conflicts. And then with the judicial branch, or the courts, again, this notion of adjudicating and resolving conflicts. How do the courts go about making decisions, resolving conflicts over the law? We'll get into that. So questions to consider about the bureaucracy. And again, these will be posted in Blackboard, something that you want to be thinking about, perhaps taking notes as you're working your way through the chapter. What are the duties and the powers of the bureaucracy and people who work in the bureaucracy, known as bureaucrats? How has the bureaucracy in American government evolved over time? Early on, there were very few departments. Yes, the departments were mentioned in the Constitution, but there was no structure. There was no idea behind what a department should be. Certainly, the bureaucracy has evolved over time to where we have it in modern contexts. A Department of Defense, a Department of Homeland Security, a Department of the Interior, the Justice Department. How has the bureaucracy evolved over time? How are bureaucrats hired, and under what conditions nowadays? We oftentimes talk about government employees. They get their jobs. They may have their jobs for life. Well, why is that? Something to think about as you're reading that particular section in the chapter. How are bureaucracies structured? And what are the different models to structuring these bureaucracies? There are different ways to go about setting up government agencies, different types of government agencies, things that you'll want to be thinking about. And then finally, what are the ways that bureaucracies are checked by other branches? Remember, we talk about each branch of government has its own power, but oftentimes it has to share that power with the other branches. If the bureaucracy is pulling all three of those branches' powers together, how then are the other branches checking the bureaucracy? Then when you get into chapter 13 regarding the courts, some questions here to think about. What are the responsibilities and duties of the judiciary? What are its jobs in terms of the three branches of government? How have the courts evolved since the beginning of the Republic? Much like with the bureaucracy, the courts have expanded its powers and its capabilities. How is each court level of the dual court system structured? So here think about what is the structure of both state courts and federal courts, and then what are the advantages and potential disadvantages to such a system of two courts? What goes into selecting a judge or a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court? There are different ways, different aspects to judicial selection. And then what is the process for getting into the Supreme Court of the United States to have them hear your case? There are certain procedural aspects that are required for you to have a case heard by the nation's highest court. And then how does SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, make a decision about a particular case that it hears? And then finally, much like with the bureaucracy, what are some of the ways that the other two branches of government can check and balance the courts? So by the end of this week, we're wrapping up, we're getting near the end here. You should be able to understand the role, the structure, and the activities of the bureaucracy. It's a critically important part of American politics. Not a lot of people understand it. You should hopefully understand the role, the structure, and the activities. Then what is the role, structure, and activities of the courts in American politics? Probably the least understood, but one of the most important components of our American political system. And then consider altogether how the four institutions of government impact American politics, and in particularly how they impact the game of American politics as well. Again, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to me. We're nearing the end, just one more week after this, and then you'll be wrapped up for this particular course.